Nice to meet you guys again. You watched the video from this channel. You guys have become a donor for humanity. Hope you are healthy, long life, success, and happy always. Well, this time we will discuss again a leader who very influential of all time. Don't take long, let's watch the story. Enjoy watching.
Well, here's the story. Abraham Lincoln, born February 12, 1809, died April 15, 1865, was the 16th President of the United States, who served from March 4, 1861 until his assassination. He led his nation out of the American Civil War, defending the nation's unity, and abolished slavery. However, as the war drew to a close, he became the first U.S. president to be assassinated. Prior to his inauguration in 1860 as the first president of the Republican Party, Lincoln was a lawyer, Illinois legislator, member of the United States House of Representatives, and twice failed in the Senate election. An opponent of slavery, Lincoln won the Republican presidential nomination for the United States in 1860 and was later elected president. His reign was always marked by the defeat of the Confederate States of America, which was pro-slavery, in the American Civil War. He issued a decree ordering the abolition of slavery through the Proclamation of Emancipation in 1863, and added the 13th Article to the U.S. Constitution in 1865. Lincoln closely monitored the war, including the election of warlords such as Ulysses S. Grant. Historians have concluded that Lincoln organized the factions within the Republican Party well, bringing each faction leader into his cabinet and forcing them to cooperate. Lincoln managed to defuse tensions with Britain following the Trent scandal in 1861. Under his leadership, the North succeeded in occupying the South from the start of the war. Lincoln was then re-elected President of the United States in 1864. Opponents of the war criticized Lincoln for his refusal to compromise on slavery. On the other hand, conservatives from the radical Republicans, the pro-slavery Republican faction, criticized Lincoln for his slowness in the abolition of slavery. Although hampered by various obstacles, Lincoln managed to unite public opinion through his rhetoric and speeches. His best speech is the Gettysburg speech. Near the end of the war, Lincoln was moderate towards Reconstruction, yearning for the nation's reunification through a soft policy of reconciliation. His successor, Andrew Johnson, also longed for white reunion, but failed to defend the rights of the newly freed slaves. Lincoln is considered the greatest U.S. president in American history. Lincoln became the first president of the United States to be assassinated. In addition to Lincoln, the presidents of the United States who died because they were assassinated include James F. Garfield, William McKinley, and John F. Kennedy. Abraham Lincoln was born in a cabin in Kentucky, February 12, 1809. His parents were poor and uneducated. Lincoln himself only had about a year of education, but in a short time he could read, write, and count. When he grew up, he tried hard to increase his knowledge. He made the best use of all the books he could read, and finally he succeeded in becoming a lawyer at the age of 28 years. Lincoln's first romantic interest was in Rutledge, whom he met when he first moved to New Salem. In 1835, they were involved in a relationship, but not officially. And Rutledge died at the age of 22 on August 25, 1835, most likely from typhoid fever. In the 1830s, she met Mary Owens of Kentucky when she was visiting her sister. As a young man, Abraham Lincoln worked in various fields of law. He had worked as a woodcutter, served as a soldier, was a sailor on river ships, a clerk, ran a shop, was the head of the post office, and eventually became a lawyer. He was active in defending the rights of African slaves. During his tenure, there were many slaves in the South and he wanted the slaves to be freed. The people disagreed with his plan, forming the Southern Union and an army to fight against Lincoln's Northern forces in the North-South War. His army won the war. His first step into politics came in 1832 when he was 23 years old. At that time he was trying to be elected to the Regional House of Representatives for the state of Illinois, in West Central America. But he lost the election. 2 years later he tried to come back and won. After that, he was elected 3 times in a row after that. From the early 1830s, Lincoln was a steadfast Whig and professed Friends in 1861 to be, an old line of Whigs, a pupil of Henry Clay. The party, including Lincoln, favored economic modernization in banking, protective tariffs to fund internal improvements including railroads, and supported urbanization as well. Lincoln returned to practicing law in Springfield, handling every kind of business that could come before a prairie attorney. Twice a year for 16 years, 10 weeks at a time, he appeared in the county seat in the mid-state area when county court was in session. Lincoln handled many transportation cases amidst the nation's western expansion, particularly conflicts arising from the operation of river barges under the many new railroad bridges. As a boatman, Lincoln initially favored those interests, but eventually represented whoever hired him. In fact, he went on to represent a bridge company against a boat company in a landmark case involving a canal boat that sank after hitting a bridge. In 1849, he received a patent for a flotation device for the movement of ships in shallow water. The idea was never commercialized, but Lincoln was the only president to hold a patent. In the 1850s, slavery was still legal in the southern United States, but was generally prohibited in northern states, including Illinois, whose original 1818 Constitution prohibited slavery, as required by the Northwest Ordinance. Lincoln approved of slavery, and the spread of slavery to new U.S. territories in the West. He returned to politics to oppose the pro-slavery Kansas-Nebraska Act, 1854. This law repealed the restrictive slavery of the Missouri Compromise, 1820. Senior Senator Stephen A. Douglas of Illinois has incorporated popular sovereignty into the act. Provided Douglas, who opposed Lincoln, certain settlers had the local right to determine whether to allow slavery in the new U.S. territory, rather than having such a decision restricted by the International Congress. The Senate campaign featured 7 Lincoln-Douglas debates from 1858, the most famous political debates in American history. The principles stood in contrast both physically and politically. Lincoln warned that the slave power threatened Republican values, and accused Douglas of distorting the values of the Founding Fathers that all humans were created equal, while Douglas emphasized his Freeport doctrine, that local settlers were free to choose whether to allow slavery or not, and accuses Lincoln of having joined slavery. The debate has a prize-fight atmosphere and draws crowds of thousands. Lincoln argued that Douglas' theory of popular sovereignty was a threat to the morality of the nation and that Douglas represented a conspiracy to prolong the slavery of the free state. Douglas said Lincoln challenged the authority of the U.S. Supreme Court and Dred Scott's decision. On May 9 to 10, 1860, the Illinois Republican State Convention was held in Decatur. Lincoln's followers organized a campaign team led by David Davis, Norman Judd, Leonard Swett, and Jesse Du Bois, and Lincoln received the first support to run for president. Utilizing the legend of decorating the border with his father, clearing dirt and splitting fence rails with an axe, Lincoln supporters adopted the label, the Rail Candidate. In 1847, when he was 38 years old, he was elected to the American House of Representatives. Abraham Lincoln became famous throughout the country as a political man, due to his debates with Stephen H. Douglas in the election campaign. American Senator in 1858. Even though he lost the senator election, the Republican Party chose him as a presidential candidate in the 1860 election. At that time, the United States was almost divided over the issue of slavery. November 6, 1860, Lincoln became the 16th President of the United States, and a month later, the American Civil War between the states in the North and the states in the South broke out. Although he hated war, President Lincoln accepted it as the only way to save the nation's unity. In the midst of the Civil War, President Abraham Lincoln issued the Proclamation of Liberation that changed the lives of many in America. The proclamation stated that all slaves in the states or territories of states who opposed the United States would be free from January 1, 1863. Union. President Abraham Lincoln was re-elected in 1864, in the midst of United States military victories leading up to the end of the Civil War. In his peace planning, President Abraham Lincoln was flexible and generous. He invited rebellious Southerners to lay down their arms and return to America, United States. The spirit of his guide was clearly similar to the spirit of his second inauguration speech. This sentence is engraved on one of the walls of the Lincoln Memorial, in Washington, D.C., which reads, "On November 6, 1860, Lincoln was elected the 16th President of the United States, defeating Democrat Stephen H. Douglas, John C. Breckinridge of the Democrat Southern, and John Bell of the New Union Constitutional Party. He was the first president of the Republican Party. His victory was entirely due to the strength of support in the North and the West. No votes were cast for him in 10 of the 15 Southern slave states, and he won only 2 of the 996 counties across the Southern states." The commander of Fort Sumter, South Carolina, Major Robert Anderson, sent a request for provision to Washington and execution of the order. Lincoln to fulfill a request seen by the separatists as an act of war. On April 12, 1861, Confederate troops opened fire on Union troops at Fort Sumter, forcing them to surrender, and the war began. Historian Alan Nevins argues that the newly appointed Lincoln made 3 miscalculations: underestimating the gravity of the crisis, overestimating the strength of Unionist sentiment in the South, and not realizing the Southern Unionists insist there will be no invasion. After the Battle of Fort Sumter, Lincoln realized the importance of taking direct executive control of the war and creating an overall strategy to put down the rebellion. Lincoln experienced an unprecedented political and military crisis, and he responded as commander-in-chief, using unprecedented force. He expanded the power of war, and imposed blockades on all Confederate shipping ports, disbursed funds prior to seizure by Congress, and after suspending habeas corpus, arrested and imprisoned thousands of suspected Confederate sympathizers. Lincoln was supported by Congress and the Northern public for this action. In addition, Lincoln had to contend with strengthening the Union's overwhelming sympathies in the slave nation's borders and keeping the war from becoming an international conflict. After the Union defeat at the First Battle of Bull Run and the retirement of Winfield Scott in late 1861, Lincoln appointed Major General George B. McClellan General-in-Chief of all Union soldiers. McClellan, a young Western graduate of Point, railroad executive, and Pennsylvania, the Democrats, took several months to plan and attempt his Peninsula campaign, much longer than Lincoln would have liked. The aim of the campaign was to capture Richmond by moving the Army of the Potomac by boat to the peninsula and then overland to the Confederate capital. McClellan's delay reiterated the frustrations of Lincoln and Congress, as was his position that no troops were needed to defend Washington. Lincoln insisted on holding some of McClellan's troops in defense of the capital. McClellan, who consistently overestimated the strength of the Confederate troops, blamed this decision for the eventual failure of the Peninsula Campaign. Lincoln understood that the federal government's power to end slavery was limited by the Constitution, which, prior to 1865, committed the matter to individual states. He argued before and during the election that the eventual extinction of slavery would result from preventing expansion into new U.S. territories. At the start of the war, he also attempted to persuade countries to accept emancipated compensation in exchange for their prohibition of slavery. Lincoln believed that limiting slavery in this way would economically abolish it, as the nation's founding fathers hoped, under the Constitution. President Lincoln rejected 2 attempts at limited geographic emancipation by Major General John C. Fremont in August 1861 and by Major General David Hunter in May 1862, arguing that it was not in their power, and that it would interfere with border states loyal to the Union. With the Union's overwhelming victory at the Battle of Gettysburg in July 1863, and the defeat of the Copperheads in the Ohio elections in the fall, Lincoln maintained the base. Strong party support and was in a strong position to redefine the war effort, despite the New York City draft riots. The stage was set for his speech at the Gettysburg Cemetery on November 19, 1863. Defying Lincoln's prediction that the world will note little or long remember what we say here, this address became the most cited speech in American history. Meade's failure to capture Lee's troops for retreating from Gettysburg, and the continued passivity of the Army of the Potomac, persuaded Lincoln that a change in command was needed. General Ulysses S. Grant's victories at the Battle of Shiloh and in the Vicksburg campaign impressed Lincoln and made Grant a strong candidate to lead the Union Army. In response to criticism from Grant after Shiloh, Lincoln said, "I can't let this guy go. He fights." With Grant in command, Lincoln felt the Union Army could relentlessly pursue a series of coordinated attacks in multiple theaters, and had commanders agree on the use of black troops. While the war was still being waged, Lincoln faced re-election in 1864. Lincoln was an accomplished politician, uniting and holding together all the major factions of the Republican Party, and bringing in the war Democrats such as Edwin M. Stanton and Andrew Johnson as well. Lincoln spent much hours a week talking to politicians from across the land and using his patronage power, greatly developed during peacetime, to hold the factions of his party together, build support for his own policies, and fend off radical attempts to knock him off the ticket of 1864. The 1864 convention, Johnson elected Republican Party, Piedmont Democrats from the southern state of Tennessee, as the vice presidential nominee. To expand his coalition to include the war Democrats as well as the Republican Party, Lincoln ran under the new Union Party label.
Well, that's a little story. Hopefully it will inspire, motivate, increase knowledge, and of course you will become smarter. Don't forget to continue to follow other interesting stories. Thank you very much for watching. Bye bye.